Hello, and welcome everyone to the 14th webinar in Contact's Produce Safety webinar series. This second season continues to tackle fresh produce safety topics every month through a dynamic webinar series that will continue to bring together industry, academia, and regulatory minds to solve some of the produce industry's biggest and most timely challenges. This series is part of a larger industry outreach and risk mitigation project called Contact, or Scientific Challenges and Cost-Effective Management of Risks associated with implementation of produce safety regulations. This project is supported by the Specialty Crops Research Initiative from the USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This webinar series, coupled with other research and extension efforts, is part of a collaborative effort across 10 different universities and government institutions to enhance produce safety knowledge and compliance across the industry. We are so grateful to our collaborators for their efforts and support of this webinar series. This webinar series will continue next month with Natalie Dyson of Dole Food Company and Justin Kerr of Factor 4 Solutions. They'll discuss key harvest sanitation learnings from food outbreak investigations and practical strategies that you can use in the field on Thursday, April 6, 2023. We hope you'll join us. This year's webinar series will address brand new topics chosen by you. Also, for those that fill out the evaluations, again, we hear you. Root cause will be coming in season 3, as well as other additional case studies and applications to the produce industry. We've still got an exciting list of webinars scheduled for this year, covering topics like Won't You Be My Neighbor, coexisting in your farming community while navigating the complex world of produce safety. If you think a topic is missing from this list, or you'd like to see something in the future, let us know in the comments, webinar surveys, or on our social media pages. While the webinar series lets us meet with you once a month, you know what I'm going to say, that's just not enough for us. We'd love to #make contact with you about today's webinar or other produce safety news and outreach on our Twitter and Instagram pages. Follow us on these platforms at ps_sci. Be sure to check out the Contact website and YouTube page for more produce safety resources, including our key takeaway documents, webinar recordings, and much more. Subscribe to our page and get instant notifications of content, like our soon-to-drop mini webinars. A quick reminder for today, if you would like to submit a question for our speaker during or before the Q&A session, please submit your questions through the Q&A box and not the chat box. Now, let's welcome our speaker today. Dr. Robert Scharff is an applied economist professor in the Department of Human Sciences at The Ohio State University. He earned a PhD in economics from Duke University and a JD from George Mason University School of Law. Prior to his employment at The Ohio State, Dr. Scharff was a regulatory economist at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Scharff's research is focused on the economics of risk, with special emphasis on risk from consumption of food and other related products. His food safety work focuses on economic burden of illness, program evaluation, and risk analysis. His research has been funded by the USDA, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the USAID, the Association of Public Health Laboratories, the Produce Safety Project, and the Ohio Agricultural Research and Development Center. Welcome, Rob. The floor is yours. I know we're all very excited.
The title of my talk is It Must Have Been the Chicken, Attribution of Illness Burdens to Specific Foods. So I came up with this title, and it really wasn't that hard, in part because it's a joke around my household that whenever I get any kind of gastrointestinal illness, I always blame it on the chicken. I think it goes back to when I was younger. I had a couple of incidents where I got pretty decently ill, and it was always after eating chicken. Now, in my case, that's because I eat a lot of chicken. It's my favorite food, so it tends to happen a lot. But that doesn't mean that's what's actually causing me to get ill. And that's what the topic of today's discussion is. How do we try to figure out what it is that's making us ill? And again, don't blame the chicken. As I said, most of the time when you think you're ill from something, it's probably something else. So why do we get it wrong? We have a natural desire to understand why things happen, but incubation periods for foodborne pathogens vary from hours to several days. So because of that, we think of the last thing we ate, but in fact, it may have been something we've eaten as long as a week ago that's making us ill today. So why should we do better? Why is it important to understand what it is that's actually making us sick? From an economist's perspective, illnesses are bad because they decrease utility. They make us worse off. But also consumer demand, that reduction in utility leads to consumer demand for safety from both industry and government. And so we know something is going to be done when people are getting sick. So from my perspective, if something's going to be done, it's most important to target our efforts where they really need to be. So we need to be designing cost-effective interventions that are very narrowly targeted. So the key for this, to do this, is to understand burden of illness for specific food pathogen pairs. When I signed up for this, my understanding is that this is a pretty diverse group of people. We have a lot of industry people here, a lot of government people, a few academics scattered throughout. And so it's really, I don't know exactly where you're coming from in terms of your knowledge and skill set. So my thought was that I would focus throughout the presentation on talking about how we come up with these burden of illness methods. Many of you may already know this, but along the way, I'll also sprinkle in some new results that we have for the burden of illness, and in particular focused on burden of illness for produce. Oh, and then next on the roadmap, we will then look at the model and recent estimates. All right, so how do we estimate burden of illness? There's a number of different sources for burden of illness estimates. One is quantitative microbial risk assessment. And the reason I put this first is because we're actually doing this on this project, this contact project that's sponsoring this webinar. And basically, these quantitative risk assessments link pathogens in the environment to human illness using dose response and exposure assessments. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Another source of data for burden of illness estimates is surveillance systems. There are syndromic surveillance systems. There are also pathogen-based illness reporting systems, and I'll talk about both of those. Next, expert opinion. Expert opinion, in many cases, we really don't have good information. And as you'll see when we look at some of my estimates, you'll see some estimates that are based on maybe 1 or 2 outbreaks. I've generated the estimate, but would I ever use that in a policy environment? No, absolutely not. In cases where information levels are low, expert opinion can be really useful in filling gaps and supplementing other data that we have. And that falls into the final category as well, which is a combination of data sources. We tend to use all of these together to some degree to make decisions about how to address foodborne illness. All right, starting with the quantitative microbial risk assessment. What is this? The starting point for this QMRA is that you have a pathogen there's pathogen presence in the environment or in a vector of interest, and you're trying to look to see how that affects illness. How do we get to that point? How do we get to estimating the burden of illness? We do that through pathogen growth models, dose response models, exposure assessments. Essentially, that's not really giving enough credit to what these models are about. They're absolutely humongous models, taking into account a vast number of different factors, and they can come up with some really good estimates. And as a result, they can be really useful, especially where there's a need for vector-specific burden measures, a need to identify critical control points, or a need to evaluate interventions. And these can be validated by assessing consistency with surveillance-based methods. And that's part of what I'm doing here is I'm generating some estimates that can be used alongside our QMRA estimates that we're generating for this project. And then typically these estimates are incorporated in a risk analysis framework. And again, many of you have already seen this, so I'll go through this very quickly. The quantitative microbial risk assessment has 4 primary components. There's a hazard identification. What is the problem? What is the thing that could cause harm? And today what we're talking about events that could lead to human illness. The next thing that's important is dose response, the relationship between pathogen exposure and illness. So how much of a dose do you have to get before you become ill? Exposure assessment, the magnitude, frequency, and duration of exposure. And then finally, putting all of those together, we end up being able to characterize the risk, which is, in my case, I'm most interested in both human health, but also economic consequences. And this risk assessment generally works within a broader category of risk analysis. So there are a number of elements in a risk analysis. These are risk assessment, I just talked about that, but also risk communication across all stakeholders. In a sense, what we're doing right here today is a form of risk communication. And then finally, risk management, where the information that's provided in these types of settings is used by risk managers to interventions and make policy choices. Now, the pros of this approach, you can target specific food and environmental vectors, you can get very good estimates. The biggest con is that they're really time consuming and really expensive. Another con is that the usefulness of this approach is limited to pathogens and foods that are targeted by the QMRA, so you can't go beyond that. And as a result of that, you can't really get a sense of how important that particular pathogen or risk that you're measuring is compared to others. Let me briefly talk about surveillance-based burden estimates. These basically come from surveillance systems that collect data on disease reports from healthcare providers and health labs. Reporting may be voluntary in some cases for some, and that's true for some pathogens. And in some cases, reporting is mandatory. So there's a list of pathogens, for example, that the CDC maintains, or that basically public health labs must report to the state, and the state must report to the CDC. So there's two types of surveillance. There's passive surveillance, where healthcare providers, labs, and victims self-report cases. This leads to incomplete reporting. It's relative, but it is relatively inexpensive. And one passive surveillance system that many of you might be familiar with is the Notifiable Disease Surveillance System, which is maintained by the CDC. Again, some of those pathogens are mandatory reporting, but even though they're mandatory reporting, you often don't get everybody actually reporting. Lots of data slips through the cracks. An alternative to that is active surveillance, where public health agencies contact healthcare providers and labs to elicit information about recent cases. Now, this leads to more complete reporting, but it is more expensive and more labor intensive. And for this reason, the CDC maintains active surveillance only in a few states. Another type of surveillance is syndromic surveillance. And this is a type of surveillance where you're collecting data on symptoms, not illnesses. And these are ultimately linked to pathogens, although there's no test that has proven that there's an actual connection there. Now, multiple pathogens may be involved, and so it's difficult to sometimes understand what exactly it is that's causing somebody to get ill. Now, this can be used as a basis for burden estimates or epidemiological investigations, but by itself, it's not really going to help target the problem. In the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly go over this. Syndromic surveillance the data is typically collected by public health agencies, but there are some private online reporting systems beginning to be used. For example, iWasPoisoned.com, Yelp, Twitter. Some researchers have looked at using these online websites to look for sentinel cases or sentinel events that might the beginnings of an outbreak. And we have seen a few isolated successes there. How do we estimate burden of illness with syndromic surveillance? We basically take this number of cases with symptoms, multiply it by the percentage of cases attributed to a pathogen, which gives us the number of cases attributed to the pathogen. Very straightforward. Now, this can be further modified to estimate illness numbers from given vectors. It's much more difficult using this system and then alternatives. And as expert opinion can be used to fill data gaps. The pros and cons: pros, less need for hard data than other methods. Con, typically less precise estimates. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is burden of illness, pathogen-based burden of illness, or pathogen-based surveillance, should I say. And basically with this surveillance system, data is collected on illnesses linked to pathogens. So again, here, unlike the previous syndromic surveillance, we actually have a connection to specific pathogens. Now, the pathogen can be clinically suspected or lab confirmed. However, in these cases, you have very good reason to believe that it is connected to a particular pathogen. Generally, with syndromic surveillance, you don't really even have that. Information is collected that's collected through this method includes whether the pathogen is suspected or confirmed, whether an ill person was hospitalized or died, the demographic profile of an individual, and the vector of contamination, the food vehicle. And so this is really the reason I wanted to go through all this, is because this is really when we start to look at this question of burden of illness associated with foods, this is really the starting point. We really need to have this connection between a pathogen and a food at the surveillance level. Why is this useful? It improves epidemiological investigations, makes it more likely that we'll detect outbreaks, and can be used as a basis for burden estimates. So how do we estimate that? Again, we have a certain number of confirmed or suspected cases. We extrapolate to account for underreporting and underdiagnosis. And there's been some research into that has come up with some good numbers. Again, always looking out for new, better estimates, but until those come out, the ones that are out there are pretty good. And combining those two gives you the number of cases attributed to a pathogen. And this can be further modified to estimate number of illnesses from given vectors. Again, as with all these, expert opinion can be used to fill data gaps. So what are the pros and cons of this approach? The pro is laboratory confirmed cases, when you have those, again, you don't always have them, can be tied directly to patient histories. And it allows you to understand severity measures, how severe what were the outcomes associated with a particular and with particular illness from a particular pathogen. The con, of course, with this is that there are higher data needs. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is final method of estimating burden of illness that I want to talk about is expert opinion. And there's a number of ways of doing this, but I think that the one that most people tend to follow, most experts tend to follow when they're doing this, is they basically tend to use a structured approach using a Delphi elicitation method. What is that? That's basically a situation where you send questionnaires to experts asking for numerical estimates and the reasons why they have given those numerical estimates. And so in this case, we'd be asking them, what do you think is what proportion of salmonella cases, for example, are associated with leafy greens? That would be a perfectly reasonable question to ask. You send out that questionnaire to the experts, asking for their numbers, asking for the reason why, and an anonymized summary is sent back to all the experts. They use that to update their own beliefs, to say, I hadn't thought about that, for example. And then they update their estimates, their numbers that they give, and they send those updated numbers back to the researchers. It's a minimum of 2 rounds, but it can be more in this kind of case. We also, many of us are guilty of having engaged in unstructured expert opinion elicitation, where you basically consult with experts to get opinions and use that to move forward. Now, if you're trying to get something published, that can be more difficult, but it is an approach that is used when time is of the essence. So the pros and cons of this approach: it's useful where data does not exist or cannot be trusted. And we're going to look at some examples today where that's the case. And the con is that experts may be wrong. And if they're wrong, then they're going to be in an echo chamber where they're just reinforcing their own wrong ideas. And as we know, and as I'll show today, over time, what is a problem, what is empirically a problem, changes. So the goal for today is to provide up-to-date estimates of the economic burden of illness for specific food categories. And in particular, because of the topic of this seminar series, the focus will be on produce and leafy greens. The method will basically combine results from 3 models to estimate burden. All right, so if you look at it, this is the basic model that will be used here. And as you can see, there's 3 primary models. At the top, you can see there's an illness incidence model. There's also a food attribution model. And at the bottom, you can see that there's an economic model. And so estimates are derived separately for each of these models and then integrated ultimately into one burden of illness, set of burden of illness measures. First, the illness incidence and food attribution models are combined to create a set of estimates for number of illnesses associated with particular pathogens and food categories. And then those are combined with the economic model to derive economic costs by pathogen and food category. You see there that I also say state. We're currently working on state-specific numbers. We're not quite ready for prime time on those, but I just wanted to leave that in there just to give you a heads up. That is something that will be added in the future. All right, so starting with the illness incidence model. And many of you are familiar with this model. This is basically basis for foodborne illness for this model is the Schallen study. This is the CDC's official estimates of foodborne illness in the United States. And it's largely based on reported illnesses, starting with case-confirmed illnesses. Those are adjusted for underreporting and underdiagnosis, which leads to a total number of estimated cases. And then those cases are to be either mild or moderate or severe, or possibly even leading to death. So you have people who don't go to the doctor, people who go to the doctor, people who are hospitalized, and then finally people who die. And ultimately, it gives you the number of illnesses by pathogen and outcome. I'm not going to go through this, but this is the basic method that the CDC uses to come up with these estimates. they use this foodborne illness, burden of illness pyramid that starts with confirmed cases and builds to using multiple surveys, multiple data sources to come up with estimates for the number of illnesses associated with given pathogens. And they look at a wide variety of pathogens. This is the list of pathogens that they look at. And by the way, they not only include these pathogens, they also include, which includes the key bacterial, like Stechin, Salmonella, some of these others, parasitic and viral agents, but they also look at unspecified agents, which you'll see me reference those as either unspecified or unknown. Basically, the idea here is there's a whole lot of illnesses out there that we don't know what the cause is. So we don't have pathogens associated with those illnesses. And this is the method here to try to come up with a total number of unspecified agents is, again, it starts with syndromic surveillance. We talked about that. And you take the total number of acute gastroenteritis illnesses, apply it by the percent attributed to food, subtract cases attributed to known pathogens, again, because we only want to be looking at unspecified agents, and that gives you the number of foodborne illnesses not attributable to any pathogen. And so the results are detailed pathogen-specific estimates for number of illnesses, hospitalizations, and deaths. This is from the Scallon paper. And you can see at the bottom, there are a total of 9 million illnesses from specified pathogens and another 38 million that we don't know what's causing those illnesses, which to give us a total of 47.8 million total illnesses. All right, so that's the illness incidence model. Now I'm going to move on to the food attribution model. And this is really where the bulk of the new information is going to be for today's talk. All right, so let's talk a little bit about attribution. So estimates that exist, the ones that are in the literature, and there is a growing literature. And essentially what this literature tries to do is tries to attribute illness to both foods and pathogens at the same time. Because if you can do that, benefit is, again, you can target your efforts to try to reduce foodborne illness, okay? Instead of trying to come up with very broad measures to try to make sure people are acting safely, you can look for what is it that's actually causing the problem. So there's this growing literature. The problem is that current attribution estimates are based on older outbreak data. And so the Painter study 2013, this is still listed on the CDC's website as their full estimates of attribution of illness, although we'll talk about it in just a second, but CDC is moving beyond that. Or they're based on dated expert elicitations. So there are some expert elicitations that have been done for many of the different pathogens we're going to talk about and to try to pair with foods. But most of those are older or are focused on a very small number of pathogens, which brings us to the final point. There are also attribution estimates out there that are better, but cover only a small number of pathogens. So for example, IFSAC, which includes CDC, has been for the last 7 or 8 years, putting out annual estimates for Salmonella, Listeria, and I think it's E. coli is the third one. And those are pretty good estimates, but again, it's limited to the number of a small group of pathogens. So solutions, we need to have improved methods for evaluation of a broader number of pathogens and foods, and we need to use updated and improved attribution. Okay. So how did we go about doing this? We start with, and this is most of the attribution studies that are done out there are based on outbreak data. And I know that there are some limitations to using outbreak data. One of the biggest limitations is that, of course, only a small percentage of actual illnesses are represented by outbreaks. And so you don't know how representative those outbreaks are of the background risk. So, it's a problem, but there aren't really good alternatives to it at this point. So we do start with the CDC National Outbreak Reporting System, NORS, looking at it from outbreak level data and we're looking only at those that have pathogens and foods. We also do actually look at the other category as well. The years that we include go from 1998 to 2020. That's 22 years of data. There are rightfully some objections to using data that goes back to 1998 because a lot of things have changed since 1998, and I will address that. But it is an issue, and I will address that, how we deal with that. There are some key variables in the data. We have the year and month of the outbreak, number of outbreaks and illnesses from outbreaks, ingredients and foods. We have, are the ingredients or are the foods confirmed, or are they just suspected? We have information about that. Etiology, meaning what is the pathogen? What is the bug that's going to get you sick? And again, is it confirmed or is it suspected? And we also have information on the location of the outbreak, the state, both the state and also the place, meaning was it in a restaurant? Was it somewhere else? So as I said, there's a fair number of teams working on this, all doing very good work. And a number of different modeling choices have been made by these different research teams. And one of the areas, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but one of the areas is attribution categories. What categories do you include? What types of foods? Do you include suspected or unknown? Do you include complex foods or just simple foods where you know exactly what ingredient caused the outbreak? There's also different people choose different time periods. I mentioned the data set we're using goes from 1998 to 2020. Is that reasonable, or should some smaller piece of that be used? Another question is whether to use the number of outbreaks or the number of illnesses from outbreaks as the key measure of burden. And the final issue is, do you discount past outbreaks? Now, the time period, one of the issues, as I mentioned with time period, is that time period, if you do go all the way back to 1998, you're looking at a world that looks different from the world today. Things have changed with regard to foodborne illness. We've gotten better at detecting things. We've also put in place a number of interventions to try to reduce foodborne illness. So we would expect there to be changes in the number of outbreaks and illnesses associated with certain pathogens. So the question is, do you use that thing? And one way to use that data, as somebody who deals with statistics all the time, data is always good. I hate to throw away data. So one way to use older data is to discount past outbreaks. That means put less weight on past outbreaks relative to current outbreaks or more recent outbreaks. And you can see that there are a bunch of these modeling choices that we've gone through. And for all of our estimates, we use the regulatory agency categories for meat and poultry, and that comes from IFSAC. Etiologies, we're excluding those. Suspected versus confirmed etiology. Again, both of these we're including in the primary analysis, but in a sensitivity analysis, which I'm not going to be able to share today because of time, we do have some other results that look at when we do make changes to this. And again, why are we including suspected? Again, it comes down to this question of having enough data to actually come up with meaningful estimates. Yes, that data is less valuable in a sense, but it shouldn't be thrown out. That does have some value. Simple versus complex foods, I've already mentioned this. Different people have looked at this. Some have used simple foods. Some have used methods, including Painter, for looking at foods that have multiple ingredients and trying to allocate the risks across those, or the probability of outbreaks being caused by those across those different ingredients. Looking at 2016 to 2020, just so you can see how things have changed. Outbreak counts versus illness counts. Some use outbreak counts there and some use illness counts. I won't go into the whole pros and cons of those, but there is a division on that. State adjustment factors. Again, I'm not able to present the state numbers yet, but maybe a future presentation we can do that. And then finally, expert opinion is used for pathogens where outbreak numbers are low. So here are the first numbers actually that are coming out of this. There is a need for updated estimates. And as you can see here, if you look at all outbreaks from 1998 to 2020, you'll see that certain products are skewed higher in terms of the number of outbreaks associated with them. And in particular, that's meat and poultry. So both the percentage of all outbreaks and percentage of all illnesses for meat and poultry are higher when you look at the longer time period than when you look at shorter 5-year time, most recent 5-year time period. And this is a significant drop in outbreaks associated with meat and poultry. And so what have we seen in response to that? We've seen most of the other categories, produce, seafood, grains, and beans, those three in particular, the number of outbreaks associated with those types of food have increased. Other things to note with regard to outbreak characteristics, there has been a decline in annual number of outbreaks over time, decline in meat and poultry outbreaks, as I mentioned, an increase in other categories, including produce. And here's some of the details here. And you can see that we do have a fair number of outbreaks in the data set. If we look at the larger data set, in particular, you can see we have over 5,000 outbreaks in our data set. So why does this matter? Why does it matter that there has been this change? Data drives policy. And so we're not the only people who see this. Obviously, people in regulatory positions see this and they want to follow the data. And so if they see that something is food other than meat and poultry, it is beginning to, relatively speaking, become a bigger problem, it matters. It makes sense. You want to target those areas where you see a relatively bigger problem. And you can see one of the other things that you can see from this chart here is if we were to use just the 2016 to 2020 data, you can see that the number of observations that we would use to generate estimates is much smaller. So using the method where you use all of the outbreaks, the older ones might be a little bit biased, but you do discount those so that the older ones that are biased have less weight, still gives them some influence because, again, in some cases, especially when you get into very precise estimates for subcategories, you're going to end up with sample sizes that are really too small if you use the smaller data set. So you really need a larger data set to try to get at some of these relationships that we're looking at. I can see we're already starting to run out of time. The models that we're going to talk about today, the first one is based on the IFSAC model. It's a consortium of the major regulatory agencies, include CDC, FDA. And we're also going to use another model, the Puri's model, which basically is a model that does a better job at integrating complex foods, is a more reasonable way of determining the ingredients, what the weights are on the different ingredients in complex foods. So I guess we don't know. The outbreak measure again for M1 is log number of illnesses. For Puri's, it's number of outbreaks. So it is not logged. And again, log number of illnesses is used because there are some really large outbreaks that if you just use the total number of illnesses, they would dominate the analysis. And larger outbreaks are important to take into account. You don't want them to have such a dominating influence. That's why this log measure is used. Suspected etiologies are included in both of the models. The longer time range is included in both. The first one discounts past years. That deals with the time range problem. The second one does not. So that could be an issue that we can talk about. Unknown etiologies, and we actually did decide to add this at the last minute, but so that is included in the analysis as well. The produce categories that we use are defined by IFSAC, whereas that's for the first model. For the second model, we're using a group of leafy green subcategories. These are also from IFSAC, but they are not at the same, they're further down the list. All right, so what does the attribution look like? All right, so you can see here, this is using the primary model, and this is based on the effort of myself and my graduate student. So you get some kudos here. And again, we have a couple of different sets of estimates here for each of the different pathogens. And these are all attribution estimates for the produce subcategory. It is a broad category, but there's just, to break it down would be difficult in this case. So you can see that there are some differences. First of all, what are the two models that I look at here? The first one has a discount factor of 0.71. That follows what has been using, or at least used early on, based on the idea that I think it was half of the weight of outbreaks in the analysis, half of the information comes from outbreaks in the past 5 years. And you can see that if you use a different discount factor, such as 0.9, which places greater value on older ones, you can see that there are, in some cases, very different estimates for the proportion of foodborne illnesses associated with produce. And the first one there, Bacillus cereus, focusing on short term, largely on the last 5 years, has a smaller number. Whereas if you use the model that places more weight on older outbreaks, it's larger. Of course, that doesn't always work out that way. If you look at E. coli, for example, E. coli seems to be one of those where it's becoming more of a problem in outbreaks. You can see that it's gone from the one that weights older outbreaks more from 46.3%, E. coli 0157 that is, goes from 46.3% to 57.5%. So that is an indication that this is becoming more of a problem in produce. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of this, but you can let me know and I can send you some of these slides. We're also engaged in a progress to focus on attribution to leafy greens. This is the second one. And this is also an ongoing effort between myself and my graduate student. He's the one leading this particular effort, however. And here we're looking at basically 8 specific types of leafy greens and also some complex leafy green products. I'm not going to go through all this, but this is a method that we use to determine whether something was leafy greens. In the interest of time, I'll skip over that, but you can, again, take a look if you get the time. I believe this will be recorded, so you can always go back and look at it that way. And so what do the outbreak counts look like in the leafy green project? As you can see, we don't have a huge number of outbreaks, even going back to 1998. So that's why, even though we're not discounting in this one, the method does not allow for discounting, it's important to use the full data set. And for some of these categories like kale and parsley and arugula, there's just too few really, especially in the simple foods, to get anything meaningful out of it. But you can see that there are a fair number of outbreaks, especially once we include complex foods, which is the value of being able to include them. One of the values. All right, so what are the outcomes here? As you can see, some of the bigger areas where you have problems with leafy greens and illness. This is about 13% of 0157 and 22, almost 23% of other STEC cases come from leafy greens. Cyclospora also is about almost 6.5% of those cases come from leafy. And norovirus, about almost 4.5% or a little over 4.5% come from leafy greens. This may not look like a lot, but as we'll see in a few minutes, once you combine these with the illness estimates from Scalen, these numbers become really large. And let's do that now. So when we combine them with those Scalen estimates, this is what we get from the first model. You can see that there are over 10 million illnesses associated with or attributed to produce products. Fruit, seeded vegetables, and vegetable row crops are responsible for most of these illnesses. And yeah, you can see there's a lot of these are also unknown. So we don't know what the pathogen is, but we know that people are getting sick because of consumption of foods, of these foods. All right, for the second project, the one that's focused on leafy greens, a smaller, again, it is a subcategory of produce. So it's a smaller number. As you see, there are a total of about 700 and almost 713,000 illnesses attributed to leafy greens. And one thing to look at, for example, is the viral cases. You can see that there's a pretty big, large of the known cases. The biggest chunk is from viral cases, and those are mostly from norovirus. So it was only 5% of norovirus cases, but there are a huge number of norovirus cases associated with foodborne illness. So 5% still ends up leading to over 230,000 cases. All right, the final model is the economic burden model. And again, we don't have a whole lot of time. So, the basic idea here is to generate a cost of illness model. And this particular diagram I've adapted from one that has been published for years by USDA ERS. I think it's really useful. And the cost of illness that I'm looking at is focused on consumer cost of illness. So it is really limited at this point to mortality costs, medical care, work loss, pain and suffering, caregiver costs, and government expenditures on healthcare as well. There are huge costs also to industry from this, and we'll talk about some of those, but those are not at least quantified at this point. However, as part of the Contact project, one of the goals and one thing we are currently working on is trying to get better estimates for those food industry costs, because that is absolutely critical. Understand. I'm not going to go through all the details, just in this. The basic idea for costs is you first start by specifying a disease outcome tree. And with that, you essentially figure out what are all of the different outcomes you can have with a particular pathogen. And you have probabilistic outcomes associated with them. So 60% of those who have salmonellosis don't seek care and recover fully. Others do seek care and recover fully. But then there are those small number, 0.04% who die, or 5.49% who ultimately are hospitalized. For all of these cases, unless you die, there's also the potential for a sequela, which is reactive arthritis in this case, which does create a burden for individuals. So when we are assessing costs, we look at both financial and economic costs. So the financial costs associated with foodborne illness are medical costs, productivity losses, and caregiver costs. The economic costs include those financial costs, but also include pain and suffering and lost life expectancy. Economists, as opposed to finance people, tend to prefer to use the economic costs. And you may wonder why. It's because economists are trained to look at social welfare to maximize utility. So utility goes beyond finance. It includes well-being more generally. And so by including pain and suffering and lost life expectancy, you create a measure that better reflects social welfare. I'm not going to go through the details for time, but you can take a look at these in your own time. Cost of illness, there are a number of key variables or costs that come out of this. There's the cost per case, which supports evaluation of interventions examined in microbial risk assessments. So if you know the cost per case, and you know that you're going to reduce cases by some hundred, thousands, or whatever the number is, you can multiply those together and get a sense of what the benefits from that intervention would be. Total cost numbers are also important. They support efforts to assess and compare burden of disease at a pathogen level. And and to make decisions about where to push resources. And so there are some other important costs. As I mentioned, industry costs are important. There is mistaken attribution. Firms not responsible for illnesses may be incorrectly implicated or suffer from consumer response to incorrectly and misattributed outbreak. And then you also could have overregulation in some areas if you don't have good estimates of where the problems actually are. There's also cost to government, public health efforts, disability payments, and healthcare. All right, I'm not going to go too deep into this. My cost of illness estimates are based on a 2018 paper that I did. So you can see the estimates here. So moving on to the estimated produce costs. There are, when we combine the number of illnesses, as I demonstrated above, with the cost per case numbers that are generated in the slides we went through, we end up with about $18.6 billion in cost attributed to produce products. The biggest culprits are fruits, seeded vegetables, and vegetable row crops. And the economic model is also being updated for more recent costs as we speak. Okay, so for the other model, the leafy green model, there are over $1.3 billion in costs attributed to leafy green products. So again, it is a smaller portion. And if you look above vegetable row crops, the total cost is over $5 billion. Leafy greens make up a portion of that, and they make up, I guess, a quarter of that maybe. And iceberg and romaine lettuce are responsible for most of these costs. All right, so trying to get it done. In summary, produce-related illnesses, we have 3 million from specified pathogens, 7.4 million from unspecified pathogens, and 0.7 million from leafy greens. This leads to costs of 18.6 billion for produce products and 1.3 billion of which are leafy green.
Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate it. You are always one of my favorite food economists to talk to. Thank you for walking us through all of that. For all of you who have stayed with us, thank you so much. Just wanted to go ahead and remind you, April 6th, we will have our next contact webinar, Harvest Sanitation Case Studies. So we'll be going out into the field, and we'll be able to have Natalie Dyson from Dole and Justin Kerr from Factor 4 Solutions lead us through some really practical hands-on learning and different solutions that have come from some outbreak investigations. So hope to see you all there. Thank you so much again, Rob. We really appreciate it. And take care. Enjoy your Thursday.